Screen sharing. Recording is on. Spotlight, and we're ready to roll. Good evening, everybody. Welcome aboard. Wow. Baruch Hashem, we're back to learning again. Simchas for good occasions. Last week, this time, we were entering Gimel Tammuz. Gimel Tammuz, I'll just mention very briefly, original Gimel Tammuz that we know historically is the day that Yeshua was in battle to secure Eretz Yisrael under the direct instructions of Hashem. And during the war which he was fighting, he needed a miracle to extend the day, daylight hours, so that they could finish the job that they had started. And as you know, the Rebbe's position and the halachic position is that if you have a military operation, it's mandatory to not leave it hanging because it's extremely dangerous for people on both sides. And therefore, it was important for Yeshua to finish off the task at hand. And the famous miracle that took place in Gimel Tammuz was Shemesh Begivin Doim, where Yeshua arranged for the sun to stay mid-sky so that the day was extended and they could miraculously finish the battle before the sun set and win. And many, many years later, Gimel Tammuz, Tov Reish Pei Zayin, 1927, which is almost 100 years ago, was the day where the Friedrich Rebbe's sentence, his death sentence, Chas v'Shalom Rachman al-Zan, was exchanged, and he was instead sent to years in exile in Kostroma, which eventually we'll talk about soon, was then changed as well. So that was last week this time. But tonight here we're getting ready to do more learning. We missed the shir last week, and we are getting ready to learn this week's shir. So we're going to have to do a recap of where we're up to in the Parshah, and what's the story, what's going on in the Parshah. We'll then go into recap of where we're up to in the story of what's happening this week on the calendar, and then we'll go back to the Parshah of one relevant, inspiring, uplifting life message from Torah. Torah's Chaim, Hira B'Chaim, Torah Lashon Hira, that the Torah is going to teach us how to live life in a passionate, switched on, uplifting way, so that we charge towards whatever we have to do with a chayas, with an excitement and a passion, and we're not lethargic. Instead, we are confident knowing that Hashem is with us in every step we take. So let's start from the beginning, and we'll start off with what's going on in the Parshah. Just to recap, last week, Parshas Chukas, we usually mention it in the shir, it's the Parshah that gets the 38-year jump. If you blink twice, if you don't notice, all of a sudden you're reading about the Para Aduma, the red cow, the red heifer, which was way at the beginning of the 40 years in the desert. And then you blink again, and all of a sudden you're talking about Miriam passing away, and the well, and this, that, and the other, and all of that happens at the end of the 40-year period, almost 38 years later, when the Yidden are already on the other side, and it's as if nothing happened. So we spent over a book and a half, discussing that first year, and then the rest of this Sefer will be discussing what happened at the final days, the final year that the Yiddish people were in the desert, and up until the moment where Moshe Rabbeinu passes away at the east bank of the River Jordan, which is on the west side of Eretz Yisrael. So the background of last week's Sedra is that as the Yiddish people try and we're coming up from the south, because Egypt is to the south of Eretz Yisrael, and we're working our way through the desert land, circling around and looking for a way to cut in towards the left, towards the west, in order to get into Eretz Yisrael, cross over the River Jordan from what would now be called Saudi Arabia or Jordan, and be able to cross over the river to get into Eretz Yisrael, where we were promised, and we had a responsibility, a mitzvah, to go move into the Holy Land. So as we circle around, we try and cut through Edom and ask them to let us pass by, and they said no. We moved up a little bit, it's not mentioned explicitly, but Moav also turned us down. And eventually, as we came a little further north, And we came up to Eretz Sichon, and we sent a message to Sichon asking, is it okay if we pass by your country? And he blows his top. He's like, you're asking me to pass by to get into Israel? I've been hired to protect the border. This is what I'm here for. I'm here to make sure you don't come and attack Canaan and come across. Not only am I not going to let you pass by, I'm coming to get you. And he comes out to fight the Jews, even though they hadn't come close to it, they hadn't entered his land. And of course, the Yiddish people take him out. Take him out. Hashem's fighting the war. And before you know it, the Yiddish people are at the River Jordan bank, because they've taken out Sichon, which is north of Moav, which is north of Edom. But it doesn't stop there, because Og, the second mighty kingdom, drop further north, also picks a fight, and Hashem tells Moshe, don't be afraid. Same story, go for it. Take him out. That's exactly what happens. Sichon and Og town, both of those areas in swaths of land, which are on the eastern side of the River Jordan, which is in what we call today Transjordan. Jordan is called these days in the modern map. We're under the northern part of Jordan. We're under the jurisdiction now of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Yiddish people were there, settled in the land. Yiddish people were there, and they knew they could see with their eyes across the river where they had to get to. But they were waiting for the command and the instruction. And that's where this week's Parshah opens up, that just south of where they were settled was Moav. Now Moav was a kingdom that the Yiddish people had circled around, not touched. When they had said no, Yiddish people hadn't engaged in battle or any sorts of tactics against them. And there was actually a ban on the Yiddish people from Hashem that didn't allow them to do any sort of hardships or battle or upset Moav in this time. Moav was a cousin, Moav was a descendant of Lot. And Hashem says to the Yiddish people, don't touch them. However, the Parashah opens up that the king of Moav, who was a newfound king, just been appointed, Bolok ben Tzipor, Bolok was worried. And because he was worried, he figured, I need to find a clever way to make sure to take out the Yin, take out the Jews before they decide to pick a fight with me. Now, this is even though they knew and he realized that they had circled around him, that he grabbed the opportunity. So what was his creative method that he was going to use in order to try and take out the Yidden? And for this he went and he said, we have been on the receiving end of a very creative war tactic. I would like to use the same tactic we suffered from against the Yiddish people, and it's most appropriate. What's the story? Moav had been at war with their neighbor, Midian, and the Midianites had been coming to fight Moav. And at the time, Midian had hired a third party, a freelancer called Bilam, a sorcerer, who was extremely talented in his power of speech. He was a prophet, and he knew how to use his ability to curse. And he had cursed Moav. And Moav had lost the war to Midian. And now, Moav goes back to that same Midian that they'd lost the war to, and said, come, let's hire together. The same Bilam you hired against us, let's hire him now to go against the Yidden, so that the Yiddish people should be taken out and shouldn't be a rising power, a threat to our stability here in the area. And that's what they do. They go to hire Bilam. So this is the famous quote, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Whereas the Midianites were enemies to Moav and had gone to war with Moav, against Moav, and won over them. Yet Moav found it okay to team up with them because together they would fight the Yid, at least try to. And they hired Bilam, and as the story goes, at first Bilam turns them down and he says, not sure, and you're not good enough for me. I deserve more honor. I'm more worthy than that. And eventually he tries to set out to curse the Jewish people on hire from Moav, but not before Hashem meets him in his dream and tells him, you shouldn't be going, but if you want to go, go, and just know you're going to pay the price. And as he goes out, his donkey gets pulled over 3 times by the angel and tries to stop him from going to curse the Yiddish people. And he insists on continuing to go until eventually his donkey starts talking to him. And the Torah describes that only at the end, and only then does he realize that there was actually an angel standing in front of his donkey, not allowing him to continue forward because of what he is intending to do. And he only continued to travel because he was going to try and get Hashem to okay, but he knew he would never do anything without Hashem's permission. So he wouldn't be able to say any sort of curse unless Hashem allowed it to. He could already see that things weren't going according to plan, but he was still so hateful so that he became hopeful that his bad and evil plans would still be able to play itself out. And as we know the story goes, he comes to Bolok town, to Moav, where his hired people had hired him to curse the Jewish people, and they try and set him up, and he does offerings, and he tries to meditate, but every time he opens his mouth to say something about the Jewish people, it's the most gorgeous brachas, the most gorgeous blessings you don't find in the whole Torah, come pouring upon the people he was trying to curse on hire. And of course, Moav, the hirers, are furious. They've hired this guy because he's got the power to curse them, and instead, he's just bestowing blessings upon them. And they try and move to another place and a different place. He tries to put them in a place where they'll have pity on the Moabites, and then he puts them in a place where he won't see so many Israelites. He tries to set them up, and of course, each time more and more brachas come forth, until the end he realizes it ain't happening. But he turns around, and in this week's Sedra, this non-Jewish prophet, who had a power that was just enormous, uses his power of speech for not good things, and he all of a sudden turns around and he starts talking about the future to be of all the mighty nations that he could see from his position. He talks about Moab, talks about Edom, he talks about Amalek, and he also talks about the Jewish people. And he gives us prophecy about what will happen in the end of days for the Jewish people. And this becomes one of the only reference in the Torah, in the 5 books. The prophets is plenty, but in the 5 books of the Torah, which is mainly pitched around the story from the beginning of creation up until the end of when Moshe passes away, the Jewish people going to Eretz Yisrael. But he talks about what's going to happen in the times of Mashiach. And he talks about what the Yiddish people are going to be. And the prophecies for Mashiach is this week's Sedra. It's the week of Mashiach where it's referenced to, albeit by Bilam, the non-Jewish sorcerer, who is trying to hurt the Yiddish people. But it's in this week's Sedra that we have prophetic talk about Mashiach in the Torah. And Bilam is about to leave and be sent home in absolute shame. And he's the laughing stock. He's been hired to curse the Egyptian people. Not only is he not getting paid, he's being sent home red in the face. But before he leaves, the nasty Bilam, with his own hatred, says to Bolok, I haven't been able to curse the Yiddish people, but let me tell you, we have one way of overcoming the Jew. And that is, not if we try to hurt them, but if we get them to hurt their own selves. If we can get the Yid to hurt themselves, that is the surefire way to get them into real trouble. What was the way to get a Yid to hurt himself, to self-harm? And the answer is a Yiddish person is not just about politics, and the Yiddish faith is not just about our might. Instead, a Yiddish person's success is absolutely a soulful, holy connection to Hashem. And if the soulful and holy connection to Hashem is healthy, then the success follows suit. Says Bilam to Balak, let's set them up for what we know Hashem hates the most. And thereby, if the Jewish people self-harm, if they fall into this trap, you're in a winning streak. Now, in hindsight, we can safely see that a winning streak means that Yiddish people will suffer losses. And unfortunately, it was terrible losses. It doesn't mean that Yiddish people will be destroyed, chas v'shalom, which is what he was hoping to do. But it does mean that we will take a real hit. What was his idea? His idea was try and drag the Jewish people into immorality, sexual immorality, and most importantly, or together with that, through that, into idolatry. And between these two sins, which both are 2 out of the 3 cardinal sins, it's under these 2 sins we will get the Jewish people to lose their holiness and their holy connection with Hashem, which will make them punishable, and that will be the most surefire way to get the Yiddish people in trouble. And unfortunately, he does exactly that. This is the prophet. This is the person who's the blessed and gifted leader of Midian and Moav and Hayat together. And what is his advice to the people? Go and teach your own children, the children of royalty, and everyone to try and entice, to go out there and to behave as immoral as could be, and try and entice as many Jewish boys to go away from the ways of immorality, and then drag them into the idolatry that they followed, which was a Baal Pa'or, also not very honorable way of idolatry. And this is exactly what they did. And as they did that, they were unfortunately extremely successful. The tact was great. Their motive, in their mind, this was their key to survival. But what they managed to do was attract so many Yiddish boys and unfortunately drag them into idolatry in a way where so quickly spiraled into a situation where thousands of Jewish boys were out there addicted to this idolatry by way of this immorality, and it peaked when one of the leaders of the Yiddish people, the tribe of Shimon, many of whom had been taken to task by the Sanhedrin, by the court of Moshe Rabbeinu, he himself stepped forward and tried to engage Moshe in a debate, but not just in talk, in action. He came with the princess of Midian, and in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, in front of thousands of people, trying to make it look like it was okay to behave the way he was. And his argument was, if Moshe could do it by marrying a girl from Midian, where Tzipora was from, Tzipora was a daughter of Yisro, Yisro was a Kohen Midian, and he wanted to argue, if it was okay for Moshe, then it must be okay for us to do as we wish, without having to talk about whether it was allowed in the Torah or not. He wanted to just say, if Moshe could have done it, we could, which is a classic move from somebody who wants to get his way and would be happy to make it sound like the Torah is okay with it, even though they obviously know that it's not. As he was doing that, a plague was raging in punishment for the terrible behavior, and it was then that Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the grandson of Aaron HaKohen, stood up, and with a spear in his hand, killed Zimri, this Jewish leader, and Cosby, this Midianite princess. And it was at that moment the plague stopped. The shock was enormous, because Zimri was one of the leaders, a tribal leader. He was considered one of the top brass amongst the Jewish people. And here, almost a commoner, Pinchas, a young kid, had killed him in cold blood in front of everybody. But that shock was enough for the shock also, the plague, and everybody stopped. And next week's Parshah will read how Hashem responds and said, actually, this move that Pinchas did to help people, shock them out of their depravity, out of their addiction, and to see their mistake, is what saved the Jewish people. But as the Torah tells us, the death toll by this time was in the thousands. In the thousands. Thousands of people had passed away in this plague. 24,000 people, it's a big number. It's It's a big number. And this is what Bilam had done on his way out. Even though he himself didn't get paid for the hire he had done, he was happy to be able to create devastation. So that's a little bit what's going on in the Parsha. And of course, we need to think about what's taking place, learn lessons from each one of these steps. It's not a very happy ending. Although we did say that the Parsha does have some real high notes, like the brachas that we got from Bilam, like the protection Hashem laid out for us, and of course the mention and the prophecy about Mashiach, the end of days, the promise that even if it looks like we're in a dark space, we know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. All of this is in this week's Parsha. Before we get into learning one lesson, we're going to shift for a moment and talk about what's going on the calendar, because this week, I mean, every week we say there's something special, but this week is really one of the top days in the Chabad calendar in recent Jewish history, I would say. In 1927, the Iron Curtain was getting thicker and thicker. What was happening from the 1920 to 1927 was quite fast-paced, but gradually Yiddishkeit versus communism was becoming a tougher and tougher battle. And from 1920, when the Frierdiker Rebbe took over from the Rebbe Shab, and it was very similar time to the revolution, you just try and imagine how many Yiddish people, percentage-wise, of Jews in the world at the time, certainly of Ashkenazic Jewry, lived in what was the former Soviet Union, in the area that was now taken over by the communist Russia. That many Jewish people that lived there, and it was thriving. Yiddishkeit was alive. It wasn't like Germany, where the average community was not observant and trying to water down the level of Yiddishkeit. It was really tough financially. It was really tough to be Jewish security-wise. But in their religious life, well, the average community was alive and kicking. The people maybe weren't so learned. The people who didn't necessarily know there wasn't that much education available. But everyone had a fire. They had a rabbi, they had rabbanim, they had shoichtim, and people had a connection to the Yiddishkeit. And in a very short space of time, as the revolution gained traction, and the threat of anyone not being the same as everybody else, as in some people having their own religion, became more and more of an enemy to the average communist fighter. For the fight against religion, and in particular doubly against Yiddishkeit Judaism, became stronger and stronger, and the Frierdiker Rebbe, previous Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok, personally took responsibility to make sure that the thousands and thousands of rabbis across the whole country or union of countries should continue to have leadership and education and establish Jewish infrastructure. And it was extremely difficult, very, very expensive, because he had to pay wages for people who otherwise wouldn't have a job. Plus he had to be top secret, because anybody got caught out was immediately sentenced either to harsh labor, Siberia, or worse still. And the Frierdiker Rebbe couldn't afford to leave a place empty, would have to replace that right away with somebody else. And that's exactly what happened. And as time went on, it became more and more difficult, more and more dangerous, but the Frierdiker Rebbe went more and more passionate. And then Tafresh Bezayin in 1927, in the famous Farbrengen of Purim Cotton, which was before Pesach, Frierdiker Rebbe said his famous mimer, and then the massive Farbrengen, in which there was clearly the spies who were recording and reporting everything that he was saying, and he spoke open. He said it like it is. We have to understand that there is legal grounds for us to be able to hold on to our Yiddishkeit, and at the same time, we must be willing to pay every price to make sure that we educate our children. He spoke very strongly about the children being the future. And if we don't educate the children, in the next generation, there'll be nothing left. If there are no kids, there'll be no goats. And the Frierdiker Rebbe made it so abundantly clear that the number one calling was to make sure that our children have education. And he put everything else aside. Everything he was doing, not everything, but in a very big way, almost everything that he was doing for adults, the main focus was in order to make sure that children were being born al taras hakodesh, with mikvahs, and that the food that we were eating was kosher shchita, and that the children were being taught what's an aleph, what's a base, what's a kometz, what's a patach. And so many people went on Mesiras Nefesh. And then in Sivan, when it came just after Shavuos, they arrested the Friedrich Rebbe. And from that time, Test of Sivan, until Gimel Tammuz, Friedrich Rebbe went through torture in an enormous way. And they were sure, the communists were sure, that they were going to, in no time, finish off the Friedrich Rebbe and having being done with him. And miracle after miracle, Friedrich Rebbe managed to survive, and there was enormous international pressure weighing down upon the communist government to the extent that the death sentence had to be revoked. And the Friedrich Rebbe and Gimel Tammuz, which was mentioned earlier, was sentenced to go to to be sent to exile to Kostroma, which was miles away from a Jewish community. And the idea was that the Friedrich Rebbe would no longer be able to influence and to run the establishing of a Jewish infrastructure if he's out of reach. But before the Friedrich Rebbe left to his exile, at the train station, people came to hear from the Friedrich Rebbe, which of course was very dangerous because you were openly displaying a connection to the Friedrich Rebbe. And the Friedrich Rebbe again spoke very strongly and inspiringly, motivating that this is a mission for us. And his famous quote was that although we find ourselves, our bodies find itself in Golus, our souls had never been given over to the jurisdiction of anyone else, and nobody can have any control over our spirit, and our spirit will never be broken. And then 9 days later, from Gimel Tammuz to Yud Beis Tammuz, which happened to be the Friedrich Rebbe's birthday, which we will mark this week. Yud Beis Gimel Tammuz is the Friedrich Rebbe's birthday. It also became the day he was told that he is no longer an exiled citizen. He's free to go home because it was a Tuesday, and the day of rest under Stalin was moved, not being a Friday, not being a Shabbos, not being a Sunday. He wanted a day of rest to be Tuesday. So Tuesday the offices were closed. And therefore, in his schos, we have 2 days Yom Tov, because the Friedrich Rebbe only got his papers that he was actually a free man on the Wednesday, when it was the day after the weekend, if you could call such a thing, the day of rest. So Tuesday became a Yom Tov because he was informed, and Wednesday became a Yom Tov because he actually got his papers, he was free, and he finally got home after Shabbos, and the Friedrich Rebbe was free. And that day, where the Friedrich Rebbe was set free, Friedrich Rebbe made such a big deal out of it. And he said over and over again, it's not a personal freedom. And what we understand is that the reason he was in jail was not because he had a personal issue. It was because Yiddishkeit was in jail. And he was set free and survived because Yiddishkeit will survive. And although it took years, till the 1990s, for communism to fall, 70 years later, 60 years, 63 years after that, 62 or 4 years, but this was the beginning of where the Yiddishkeit would know that we will in the end overcome. And then much, much later, when the Rebbe launched the mitzvah of Oispe Sefer Torah, for example, many mitzvahs, and the Rebbe asked that each child should have a letter in the Sefer Torah, and encouraged people to buy also a letter for children in Russia who are unable to get a letter in the Sefer Torah. And the Rebbe would cry and say that there was a Russian kid who someone told him that an American kid spent an American dollar to buy you a letter in the Sefer Torah. And he turns around and he says, "Shtotekoi Sefer Torah, what is a Sefer Torah?" That's how uneducated, or how much education was ripped away. And the fellow says, "Go and ask your mother." And he turns around, he asks his mother, and his mother also says, I don't know, I have no idea. Ask grandmother. She'll probably know what is a Sefer Torah. What is a Sefer Torah? This is how much Frierdiker Rebbe fought, and it's the idea that every single Yiddish kid should have at least a little bit of an ability to know something. And maybe that something would just be that they know that they are Jewish. Or maybe that they know that they're Jewish and there's in the Hebrew alphabet, there's something called an Aleph. And these small little things of embers of Yiddishkeit that help the Yidden carry through, this is what we celebrate in Yud Beis Tammuz. The simcha, the joy of knowing that when it looks so bleak, and it looks like it doesn't make sense, and if you start asking logically, was it really worth the sacrifice? The answer is, of course it was. It's not utilitarian, where we're going to figure out how much Yiddishkeit gain and how many card-carrying members we continue to have proudly promoting. That's not at all the idea. The idea was that there was a standard set that continued to way after the Frierdiker Rebbe had to leave Russia. And for all the years throughout communism, where Yiddish people had an idea that we as Jewish people, it only got hard in the 30s, and the later 30s where Stalin Yamach Shemai was really meshuggah in how he was killing left, right, and center. But the idea where Yiddish people knew, as established by Yud Beis Tammuz, that we Jewish people stand up to whatever it takes to hold on to our Yiddishkeit, even in our little way. This was Yud Beis Tammuz's Geula. Until this day, we will celebrate Chag HaGeula. Chag means the festival, Geula of redemption. What's the redemption? So in a small way, it's the redemption that took place in 1927. But in a much larger way, it's the redemption of us as individuals, where our souls have been set free, so that we can know that whatever it is, whatever is needed in order to do what needs to be done, we are free to do that. Not because we can control our circumstances, but we can control our reactions. We can control our passion. We can get involved, and we can know that even if it looks impossible, which it did, we can step forward, the next right thing, and we don't have to calculate to know exactly how it's going to work out. We do have to calculate what is that I need to do right now. This is the Chag, the festival of Geula, of where we step up and step forward. It's this week. It's this week. We're going to catch it. We're going to draw this energy and remind ourselves that everyone has personal redemptions we're looking forward to. And the first thing is to realize that if it looks bleak, that's another way of saying we're waiting for redemption. Number two is to recognize that our personal redemption matters to Hashem. It does. And although it looks like nobody else knows, or maybe some people do know, Hashem knows. And He's waiting for our personal redemption, and He's cheering us on quietly, subconsciously. Because this is the reality of Golus. So long as we don't have the Geula, it is difficult. But this is the Chag HaGeula. It's this week that we tell ourselves that we don't have to know how it's going to work out. We do have to know that it will work out. And we should push forward. And we shouldn't get butt down. And we should continue trying. And if one way seems to be closing down on us, we keep on pushing, because we're sure there'll be another thing that we can do. That's how Hashem has set it up. It's Yud Beis Tammuz. It's Yud Gimel Tammuz. It's this week. I'm going from Gimel Tammuz to Yud Beis Tammuz. We're in those days in between. Because that's a little bit what's going on in the calendar. We're going a little bit over time, but I think it's important to bring a little bit the koyach. The Frierdiker Rebbe was Mesiras Nefesh, sacrifice, self-sacrifice, to give us that gift. We have it. It's ours. Okay, let's go back to not quickly, but let's right away do a little bit of an idea of the Parshah. Let's just see what the title was here. The title on this week's Shir was, Do Not Negotiate. Sometimes it's best not to answer at all. Okay? Sounds straightforward. We're going to learn how the Torah teaches this. When falsely accused, what is the best way to respond? I mean, I think this question is quite relevant today. When maybe a colleague, a well-meaning colleague, starts accusing, how come the Israelis do this, that, the other, or how come whatever. I'm going to borrow this question and say, when someone comes to me and says, how can you be so passionate about Mashiach? How can you be so passionate about Geula? Come on, get with it. This is already 30 years since Gimel Tammuz. It's already almost 2,000 years since the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Everyone's been talking about it for so many years. Get real. Can you really continue doing that? How do you respond to somebody like that? What is the best way to respond to somebody if they come and they challenge with something that I know to be true? I know to be absolute correct, but their starting position, their logical, rational build-up to their question seems compelling, or at least noteworthy. So if someone comes and says, well, they blew up so and so many people in Gaza, they've done such and such destruction, or so many people are against it, it seems a rational argument. How do you begin to respond when someone comes and says that? So before we go in, we're going to do a little light-hearted, jokey kind of approach, but then we want to get into what the actual answer is from the Sikha in the Chelek Yud Ches, gorgeous Sikha. This is a story, as I heard told by, I think by a Shluchim, who was saying about one of the times that they were publicly displaying Yiddishkeit on campus in one of the universities. They were approached by one of the campaigners on behalf of the Palestinian cause, which somehow became a pro-Hamas cause or whatever it was. And they were saying that you guys are mass murder, genocide, this, that, the other. And the shliach, under the circumstances, Baruch Hashem dropped an idea into his head and turns around. He says, how dare you come and tell me that? You killed your grandmother. He says to the campaigner, the non-Jewish person who wanted to start up. And he shouts at him, how can you talk to me even? You killed your grandmother. So the guy looks at him, what are you talking about? I killed my grandmother. What are you on about? Why do you even say that? See, so the shliach says to the guy, is your grandmother alive or dead? She says, oh, she's dead. He says, exactly. So I told you, you killed your grandmother. You even agree that she's dead. Of course, the fallacy in the argument is that because he agreed again, it doesn't mean in any way that he killed her. But of course, that's equally the same fallacy in his argument to consider the Israelis genocide because people are being put on the BBC or the CNN as dead. That's the jokey part. But actually, we're going to talk about what should we answer when somebody comes with a false accusation. A false accusation that's so false, but where do you begin to answer? And the answer is going to be that if the person is actually seeking to learn, then we have to figure it out. They're waiting to hear an answer and figure out how to answer their question. But the person's not looking to find out new information. If the person is looking to make a statement and they're coming to state falsely such an accusation, the best answer is to not answer. Instead, to point out the fallacy of how absurd it is, it doesn't deserve an answer. And the moment we start to answer, we've already lost the plot. We've already validated the falseness of their claim. And of course, this is true when we're talking to somebody else. And most importantly, we're going to learn in the Sikha is, if I'm talking to my own Yetzer Hara, if I'm talking to my own temptation, my own weakness, the minute I start giving in and explaining to myself why right now maybe it's okay to not give in to my temptation, but I'm already validating the fallacy of what it is, that in itself is already a slippery slope. Let's see how the Sikha plays it out and translate it into a practical way of how we live life switched on rather than dragging behind. Because when we're switched on, a lot of things fall into place that otherwise become an uphill battle over and over again. And as we said, the Friedrich Rebbe this week gives us the koyach to be confident and sure, not because we can explain the 5-year plan, but because we're confident and sure that what we need to do is forward, and that Hashem is with us. Let's see it inside. This is the story, what we mentioned earlier, the unfortunate story at the end of the Parshah, where the Yiddish people, on a slippery slope, as we said, given to extreme temptation. I'm going to use the word distraction, because that was the method with which the Yiddish people got caught in the first place. And once the distraction grabbed hold, it was a slippery slope from there. So Israel is living in Shittim, which is there where they are on the border of the river Jordan, and the people began to engage in the incestuousness with the daughters of Moab. They invited the people to the feast offerings of their gods. And the people ate and prostrated themselves to their gods. That was idolatry straight up. Israel became attached to Baal Peor. And the wrath of God was inflamed against Israel. And you got to realize, if we have somebody who always eats healthy dinner, and healthy lunch, and healthy breakfast, and one time they taste of fast food, and it's good taste, and it's easy, it doesn't take time to prepare, it's garbage, it's real garbage. We can easily see how somebody who's looking for an easy way out would very quickly get into an attachment to this rubbish of nash, of unhealthy eating, even though they may have been eating healthy for 20 years. But unless they grab themselves, it's sliding down. Here you have the Yiddish people. They'd spent 40 years connecting to Hashem, but at a moment of distraction, at a moment of where they were dragged into a glitzy excitement of Baal Peor, they were straight in, stuck to it. And the wrath of Hashem was inflamed against Israel. Hashem said to Moshe, take all the leaders of the people and hang those who sinned before Hashem facing the sun, so that the inflamed wrath of Hashem may withdraw from Israel. Idolatry. And Moshe said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill his men who have become attached to the Baal Peor. And that's when the next step of the story takes place. Behold, one man of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman near to his brethren before the eyes of Moshe and before the eyes of all Israel. Most public display. Zimri steps forward, and they were weeping at the tent of meeting's door. We're going to focus on this. Who is they, and what are they weeping about at the entrance to the tent of meeting to Hashem's home? In the meantime, Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron, great nephew of Moshe, Kohen Gadol, saw, and he rose from the community, took a spear in his hand. He sees what's going on, grabs hold of a spear. He went after the man of Israel into the tent and pierced both of them, the Israelite man and the woman, through her abdomen. The plague against Israel, in one moment, ceased. Those who died in the plague were 24,000. That's how the parasha closes. Heavy story. So the Sikha wants us to understand, first of all, what was going on and who was these people who were crying at the tent of the Aramid. And here we're going to learn from a Gemara in Sanhedrin, where the Gemara says the following. What did Zimri do? Zimri is this leader of the Yiddish people, a man in Israel, a leader amongst the Klal Yisrael, a leader of the tribe of Shimon. He arose and gathered 24,000 of Israel and went to Cosbi, a princess of Midian, and said to her, submit to me. She said to him, I'm the daughter of a king, and so my father commanded me to submit only to the greatest of them. I'm looking only for Moshe. I want to have, I'm a princess, I'm not supposed to be here acting this way. But the king of Midian has sent me as his daughter to try and create the greatest sin, that the leader of the Jewish people should sin. He said to her, I too am the head of a tribe, and moreover, I am greater than Moshe. I'm from the tribe of Shimon, and Moshe is from the tribe of Levi. Shimon is the second eldest of the tribes, as I am the second of the womb, the son of Shimon, the second son of Jacob. And Moshe is the tribe of Levi, is his third from the womb, he's the son from Levi, the third son of Jacob. In a way, I am greater than Moshe, he says to her. Look what happens next. At the moment of depravity, you'd imagine it would be a caring, loving relationship. Of course not. Zimri seized her by a forelock and brought her. He drags her by her hair and brought her before Moshe and said, son of Amram. Again, that's in the heat of the moment. All sorts of respect out the window. Calls Moshe by his father's name, son of Amram. Is this woman forbidden or permitted? And if you say she is forbidden, who permitted the daughter of Yisro to you? At that moment, the halacha eluded Moshe. Moshe didn't answer back. It's unclear for them what he should answer. All the leaders who were stood there, bawling and weeping. They were the ones who were crying. The leadership was at loss. How do we respond when Moshe can't respond in his face? And this explains that which is written. They wept at the tents of meetings, and is written thereafter. And Pinchas son of Elazar saw. When Pinchas realizes how crazy the situation was, the rapid descent to mass immorality, and one's mind's display of brazen depravity, Pinchas' enactment of swift justice brought things back to their proper order and saved the day. The plague stopped. It was a brazen act. It was an extreme act, zealous act, but it's what was needed. It was the only thing that could stop the terrible tide that had begun to spread. And that's the story of this week's Parshah at the end of the Parshah. However, Rashi says we have to understand at one moment, what was the conversation, the argument that this man Zimri placed before Moshe that made Moshe not respond? And the way Rashi is going to ask is, why did Moshe not respond? Moshe could have stopped the whole balagan had he responded to Zimri. Says Rashi, who permitted the daughter of Yisro to Moshe had married before Mount Sinai. And when the Torah was given, they were all non-Jews who entered into the general framework of the mitzvah together. Zipporah entered with them, added many converts from the mixed multitude. How Jewish were Jews before the giving of the Torah? They were Jewish because they had committed to it. They were tribal, they were Hebrews, but they were involved because they had chosen to be involved. They were Jewish because they'd committed to be Jewish. Well, they weren't even Jewish, they were Hebrews. And when they came to the giving of the Torah, they all joined the neshama aspect of it because Hashem gave them equally those who had been born Hebrews and those who were joined to the Hebrews. So what was Zimri even comparing? Zipporah had joined the Jewish people at the giving of the Torah like everyone else. She had surely converted like everyone else had become Jewish. Compare it to Cosby, who was a Midianite princess, who was an idolater and insisted on dragging Zimri towards that direction. What was he even asking? The answer to his calculation, his argument, is so obvious. It's so clear. It's such a false argument. And of course, the question is, why did Moshe not answer? As the Yalkut Raveni says, he should at least have answered Zimri. He could have said halacha came into force when the Torah was given, or simply because that had converted her. Then perhaps Zimri would have responded and returned to tshuva, and Hashem accepts all returnees. Why did Moshe not respond and allow things to get out of control? Why was Moshe at loss? It's such an obvious answer. Moshe didn't know this. Moshe couldn't think of this in the heat of the moment. So the question we're going to ask is, by flaunting relationship with Moab princess, someone was accusing Moshe of hypocrisy. Moshe had compelling answers. Why did he remain silent? Especially considering it actually costed 24,000 lives. Maybe not all of it was because of Zimri, but a lot of that could have certainly been stopped. And why did Moshe remain silent? And here we're going to learn that Zimri wasn't looking for an answer, and neither were the people who were following him. Zimri was fumbling and saying words as an excuse for what he already had decided. It was temptation, distraction, but it wasn't a rational, logical, information-seeking question at all. And that's why Moshe didn't respond, because the response to such an individual is not to respond with an argument, but just to storm straight forward and do what needs to be done. And for that, Pinchas had to step up. We'll talk in a minute why. But let's read how it is inside. The Gemara actually puts a little bit more of a Talmudic twist to the argument and says that Moshe Rabbeinu actually had an additional problem. Because although she had converted, Moshe was somewhat in a stage of like a Kohen Gadol. Because he had started the service, and if Moshe is in the state of a Kohen, a person who is from the Kohen family is forbidden to marry a divorcee, and equally is also forbidden to marry a convert. And if that's the case, Moshe would similarly have been forbidden to marry Tzipora, even if she had converted, because he was somewhat on a stage of a kohen. A woman who converted was free from slavery, even if she converted was freed when she was under 3 years of age, being that she's not a daughter of Israel, she is forbidden to marry a kohen. And this becomes the Gemara's argument. Rav says Moshe, our teacher, was a high priest and received a share of offering contrary to heaven, as it says, is Moshe's portion of the nation. And since priesthood only expired for Moshe's descendants, but he himself remained a kohen, this then becomes the argument that Zimri perhaps could have been alluding to. And therefore the question is, how indeed did Moshe justify Baron convert he was a kohen? And the answer was a very good answer. It's a very good answer that Moshe could have explained. And the answer would be because he was married to her before he became a kohen. And therefore, he owes it to her to honor the marriage. Just like you have a much more extreme case. If someone's a regular kohen and he was engaged to be married, betrothed to be married to someone who's a widow. Now, as a regular kohen, he may marry a widow, but all of a sudden he becomes upgraded before he gets married to becoming the kohen gadol. And the high priest may not marry a widow, but he's already given her his promise. He's already betrothed to her. Says the halacha, in that case, absolutely marry her. And he'll be married as a kohen gadol to a widow. Certainly he was married to her before, because the prohibition is only to go and seek out a widow whilst he's already a kohen gadol. So certainly Moshe could have answered Zimri. And there was answers that could have been given. Yet, Moshe chose not to speak up. Moshe chose to not answer Zimri, even though he had a very compelling argument. Because Moshe Rabbeinu understood that right now, it wasn't about winning arguments. It wasn't about who's going to have the last word. What was needed right now is not to figure out the academics. What was needed right now is to make sure that the action, the behavioral, the Yiddish confidence, the commitment of a Yid to do what needs to be done, that's what was necessary. And having academic arguments was not going to change the facts on the ground. And if anything, it would only give credit and lend acknowledgement on some level to the false accusations that would seemingly support the mayhem and the depravity, the misconduct that was trying to be whitewashed by a false argument. And the only answer was to not answer, instead get on with what needs to be done. Let's read inside. We do not always seek to answer the questions of others. Sometimes the question can be so impertinent and to make a Midianite seem permitted. Clearly it was false. It was obviously false. When the other person honestly intends for the sake of heaven, we must answer, even a fool, according to the foolishness. But if the other person poses a question in Torah terms with intention of permitting that which Torah forbids, we must take the approach of do not answer a fool according to the foolishness. Victory is achieved over such an opponent, not by engaging in rational debate, but by displaying logic-defying strength. Irrational commitment to what's true, even if you argue till you blue in your face. I would like to point out, there are 2 verses, 2 psukim quoted in this paragraph. Have a look. One pasuk is quoted from Proverbs 26:5. The other quote is from Proverbs 26:4. Okay, so they're 1 verse apart. Let's read them again. One verse says, answer even a fool according to their foolishness. One verse writes, the word one just before, do not answer a fool according to their foolishness. You see how similar these verses are? An exact opposite. Do not answer a fool, answer a fool. Says the Gemara. Where's it gone? Oh, here's the 2 psukim. Do not answer a fool according to his or her folly, lest you become like them. Verse 4. Verse 5. Answer a fool according to the folly, lest they be wise in their sight. Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, wisest man all the time. These 2 verses, stacked up one against the other, really need explaining. Something doesn't seem right. Well, guess what? The Gemara in Shabbos says they sought to suppress the book of Proverbs. They were going to hide the book. because its statements contradict each other. What are the statements that contradict each other? The one we just read. Verse 4, answer not a 4. Verse 5, answer a 4. Which one is correct? And the answer was they did not hide brothers, because the idea contained in these two verses is explicit within them. Do not answer him or her in a matter where answering will only bring you to their level. Let's put that slide back. If you become like them, if answering the 4 will lower the game so that the answer now becomes degraded and is grappling with the foolishness and the falsified argument, whether or not how false it is, that's when you do not answer, because the entire game is false. There's nothing to be gained from such a conversation. However, if the questioner is looking for information, and in their sight they're looking to find out, we want to make sure they don't become wise with their foolishness and justify their mistake, because they are actually looking to find out. And in that case, absolutely answer them, but answer them in their foolishness, which means help them realize the fallacy of their argument. Answer a fool, and no matter where, if you don't answer them, they'll be wise in their own eyes. So, King Solomon's advice is, if a challenge stems from well-intentioned ignorance, answer the question. But if it's an attempt at a debate at the challenge's terms, don't take the bait. Don't necessarily engage in an argument about falsehood, because it's only giving the dark side, the slippery side, an opportunity to take a good punch. And there's no need for that. There's no need to have to engage. So just to go back to our question that we had here. We asked the question, how come Moshe Rabbeinu didn't answer? And the answer is, a question asked in bad faith does not need to be answered. Instead, what is needed is a display of strength, is an appropriate response. A display of strength doesn't mean that I'll punch. A display of strength doesn't mean I'll take someone down. A display of strength means the confidence in knowing that what I need to do is right. And it doesn't need so-and-so to give me action, acknowledgement. Instead, I need to know that what I'm doing is absolutely right and have that confidence. So now we talk about other people. Sometimes it's easier to see how that will be done. But we talk about our own self. If I have a weakness, let's just say I have a weakness for getting angry. Let's just say I have a weakness for, getting worried. I have a weakness for eating garbage, or whatever it is. If I have to justify why it is or isn't okay, I've already decided to lower my bar. But if instead I can somehow find the strength to say, actually, I don't have time to get carried away in the anxiety. I don't have the bandwidth to allow myself to lose my cool right now, because there's too much that I need to achieve. I haven't engaged in the argument. Instead, I've displayed to my own self a strength in the purpose of my life, in the mission that I'm living up to. And that's the best answer to something that I actually know myself to be foolish. I don't really need junk. I don't really need a sugar fix. I don't really need to be upset or angry or worried. But it's so tempting. It's so distracting. And it's so compelling. And this we're learning from this week's Parshah. Moshe Rabbeinu looks at Zimri. He doesn't answer. And the answer comes from Pinchas. And there's a whole discussion why it was Pinchas, not Moshe. Moshe was the Gay Badavar. But the answer was, this is how it has to be. It has to be that Hashem's vision, Hashem's mission in life is the absolute. And it's that absoluteness that shocked all of the sliding Klal Yisrael, who had been dragged into this mass distraction. But the shock of doing, the strength of standing up to what's right is what got us back onto the straight and narrow and stopped the entire plague. And we can do the same. It's your base Talmud. And the Friedrich Rebbe tells us, Azoy nishtanish. Our souls were never given over not to outside forces, and our souls are not subject to, they don't owe anything to our inner devils. Instead, we can stand strong with absolute confidence that the Frierdiker Rebbe tells us that Yarech Simon Yom, we will walk out of this victorious. And with that, we can be confident to keep on going forward. And even if we have a track record that doesn't look so pretty, we keep going forward. Because we know that that's calculations that the HR would love us to engage in. But instead, we're going to choose to think out what's the next right thing to do. So good Yom Tov, everybody. Keep on celebrating. And in this week's Parshah, the Parshah of the Nevuas of Mashiach, the Parshah that talks about the prophecy of redemption, we should all have our personal redemptions. And of course, it should bring to the Gola Mitzvah Shlema. Take care of Miyad. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining.